It was a cool, peaceful evening as Edward and Henry puffed down the main line. "So, where are we going exactly?" asked Henry. At the sheds, Edward had told him to follow him somewhere, though he wasn't very specific on where they were going. "You'll find out when we get there," replied Edward. "As I said, this will help with the stress you've been having lately." Henry sighed. He knew what Edward was talking about. Earlier that day, he had failed outside Wellsworth after struggling to build up steam. The Fat Controller had been in his cab at the time to see what might be the cause of all of Henry's problems. He and the crew had come to the conclusion that Henry's firebox was too small to make enough heat, especially with the bad coal they've been having recently. The fireman suggested that Welsh coal would be better. Henry remembered the Fat Controller's response. "It's expensive, but Henry must have a fair chance." That last part, about a fair chance, had plagued Henry's mind all day. His thoughts were interrupted as he noticed that he and Edward were reducing their speeds. "Here we are." Henry looked around, surprised. The forest? The forest in question was a large one between Crovan's Gate and Ballyhoo, and the railway ran straight through it. Tall trees towered over the two engines as they stopped outside a signal box, and Edward's driver went to see the signalman. "We just need permission to move onto the sidings. We obviously can't block the main line." When the driver returned, the engines moved onto a siding each. Now what? Now, we just sit and rest. Sit and rest? "Edward, I was doing that back at the sheds, before you wanted me to follow you." "Yes, but in your position, Henry, this is a more fitting place to do it." "How is this any different from the sheds?" "Henry, relax, and look around you." Henry huffed and surveyed his surroundings. In all honesty, he had never really paid much attention to the forest, as he had always passed it at high speeds with goods or passengers. Now that he was still, he noticed that the forest was very quiet, with only a few sounds, such as the rustling trees and the chirping birds. Henry wasn't really sure why or how, but all the stress he had been feeling all day began to fade. His grumpy expression did the same. Edward noticed this. "Well, what do you think?" "Well, it is nice around here. I can't say why, though." "Perhaps the word you're looking for is peaceful?" "I suppose so. Very different from the sheds or the station. That's why I come here. Sometimes it's nice to get away from the hustle and bustle of industry and enter the world of nature." The two engines sat in silence for a while, taking in the sounds and setting. The longer they were there, the more happy Henry felt. Eventually, he spoke again. "So, how long have you been doing this?" "A few years after I came to this railway. You see, back then was when the Great War was happening, which was a very uneasy and uncertain time, as you can imagine. One day, I brought some workmen to the forest to cut down some trees. Naturally, they were making quite a racket, but when they had a lunch break, I found the area to be more quiet and relaxing. I asked my driver if we could come here in the evening. He was a little confused at first, but when we did it, he completely understood." He looked closely at Henry. "But what about you, Henry? How are you feeling?" "Much better than before." Just then, a deer came out from behind some trees. The two engines spotted it, walking towards them. It seemed curious. "Wouldn't it be afraid of something as big as us?" Perhaps, but not if we're standing still. The deer moved up to Henry and stared for a while. Henry wasn't sure how to respond. Then, without warning, the deer licked his buffer. I think it likes you, Henry. Henry gave a small chuckle too. Suddenly there was a shrill whistle as Gordon rushed by with the express. The deer jumped and ran back into the woods. Oh, bother that Gordon. I don't understand why there are whistle balls at both ends of the forest. I find it pointless, and it scares the animals. It is for their safety. There's nothing stopping them from straying onto the line. Our whistles help to warn them we are coming. Oh, well, that is true, I suppose. Henry remained silent after that, but then the Fat Controller's earlier words came back to him. He slowly looked back at Edward, one of the few engines he knew who truly cared. Edward, can I ask you something? Of course, Henry. Do you think I deserve a fair chance? I'm not sure what you mean. After all the trouble I've caused for the Fat Controller and the railway, do I deserve a second chance? Well, of course you do. You can't blame yourself for your mechanical problems. That's just the way you were designed. Something you have no control. I mean, when I stayed in the tunnel when it was raining, and when me, Gordon and James went on strike. Not to mention all the times I've been rude and stubborn. I feel like a big burden to everyone. And now, the Fat Controller is buying expensive Welsh coal just for me? Henry, let me tell you something. Remember when Thomas was to take your train and left it behind? Or when he didn't pay attention to his trucks who pushed him down the hill? Well, Or how about some of his more recent incidents? Like leaving the guard behind and going fishing. Despite those, he still runs the branch line. Why do you think that's the case? Because it's his branch line? Well, yes, but also because he realized his errors and hasn't repeated them since. The same can be said for you. The mishaps you've mentioned were very silly, but you're aware of that and haven't repeated those mistakes since. You are also a very hard worker when you're steaming properly. You can be a bit grumpy, but most of the time you're actually a very pleasant engine to be around. In fact, I've seen you talking to Percy quite a lot. Well, while he is sometimes cheeky, his optimistic manner does help when I feel down. But what if the Welsh coal doesn't work? What if I still struggle to build steam? What if all the money the Fat Controller spent was a waste? What if... Henry, whatever happens tomorrow, I know you will do your best. Thank you, Edward. The two engines then looked up at the sky and noticed that it was starting to get dark. They decided it was finally time to head home. As they moved onto the main line, Edward spoke. To answer your earlier question, Henry, I don't think, I know you deserve a fair chance.